and welcome to What Happens Next, a series curated as part of SAHAS's ongoing endeavor to equip survivors of gender-based violence and active bystanders with information toward empowered decision-making. In today's conversation, I'm speaking to Meghana Srinivas, the founder of Trustin, about workplace sexual harassment and the recourse available to survivors. Meghana, thank you so much for being available all the time with SAHAS, whether it's in conversations like this or in supporting survivors. It's always a pleasure to work with you.
Yes, same here, Kirti. It's wonderful to talk to you again. And thank you so much for running this series and for having me be part of it.
Of course, Meghana. Would love to have you introduce yourself and tell folks who are listening in or watching this video a little bit about yourself and Trustin, and then we'll get started.
All right. So hello, everyone. My name is Meghana. As Kirti mentioned, I'm the founder and CEO of Trustin. So we are a one-stop solution for your workplace safety needs. What that means is we have a product as well as services that enable you to build the safest, most inclusive workplace, right? That aligns with your cultural values. We provide a lot of support around POSH implementation, the Prevention of Sexual Harassment law. We also look at other kinds of workplace misconduct, everything from bullying, harassment, to things like fraud, to now at insubordination, microaggressions, things like that, because we believe that you deserve to feel safe and empowered in the place where you work, right? Whether it's your company or your college campus, because that's where you spend most of your time and therefore your life. And we're here to help you understand how you can have a higher quality of work life, right? And especially in today's conversation, I think we can shine more light on that.
Absolutely, Meghana. Thank you so much for all that you do. I think I can personally vouch for the fact that your work and Trustin's work has made such a powerful impact on so many survivors and so many organizations.
Thank you so much, Kirti.
Of course. So let's get started, Meghana. What is the option available to a survivor of workplace sexual harassment once an incident happens?
Yeah, I think there are actually many, many options available to the survivor, right? Kirti, as you know, you are the trained lawyer here. I think POSH is also a very employee-centric law, but many times, right, we might not be able to access it because we're not aware of our rights. So the first thing that an employee can do is, if their workplace has an internal committee, right, also called the POSH committee or the Vishaka committee in some situations, they can go ahead and submit a written complaint. Usually there will be a dedicated email ID, which will be available on the POSH poster. It might be part of their anti-harassment or POSH policy. So you can go ahead and reach out to the head of the internal committee in writing, right? After that, they will have to legally take up the case and see it through to completion. Let's say that if I am a freelancer, perhaps I'm a domestic worker, and there is no IC for me to go to, or for some reason, if I feel that I don't trust my internal committee, right? I always have the option of going to the local committee of the district. So this is, again, a 5-member committee that's constituted in every single district. Tomorrow, because I'm Bangalore based, if I want to report sexual harassment, right, in a workplace interaction, I can go ahead to the Bangalore Urban Local Committee. So a lot of these National Commission for Women helplines and the statewide websites do have the local committee information. I think Martha Farrell Foundation has also done a great job of compiling all of these local committees and district officers on their website. So users can go there. So that's one set of options for the civil cases. As you also know, any act of sexual harassment is also a crime under Indian law, right? So at any point, if the survivor feels that they would like to file an FIR, a police FIR, and therefore a criminal case, they can do that. And they can also choose to do this while the civil case or the POSH case is going on, right? So this can run simultaneously as well. So this is something that people should keep in mind, that I have the internal committee, I have the local committee of the district, I definitely have the police FIR as another option.
That was very helpful, Meghana. Thank you so much for spelling that out. So you talked about the internal complaints committee and the local complaints committee. Could you go a little bit deeper into how they are different from one another? Right.
So under the POSH law, any employer that has 10 or more paid employees, or 10 or more employees, actually, not necessarily that they have to be paid. This can include interns, volunteers, anybody under contractual obligation to the company. At that time, they have to constitute an internal committee, right? And the committee has to be upskilled and sensitized. So this is usually about 4 company employees and 1 external member who might be a lawyer, who might be specializing in women's rights as an NGO worker, right? And this external person has to be there for objectivity and neutrality of the proceedings. So this internal committee would exist within your workplace, right? In terms of the local committee of the district, it would usually be, again, 5 people, mostly working in this space, right? Very familiar with the locality as well. And they would be appointed from different government branches. And they would be running these posh cases. But let's say, again, these are the ones that are happening outside of your internal committee process.
Got it. That was a very succinct explanation. Thank you for that. So let's say a survivor files a complaint before the internal complaints committee in their company. What typically happens next?
So legally, what would happen is ideally, the internal committee will get in touch with them. They will help them, first, of course, we have to say we have received your complaint, right? And we have taken cognizance, we're going to move forward with the process. They also often have to give the survivors, the complainant, the choice of whether the complainant wants to go through conciliation or they want to have the entire legal inquiry. So conciliation is when there's a mediated conversation, right? Perhaps the complainant feels that, okay, you know what, this was an explicit joke. I did not ask to be subjected to this on my work WhatsApp group, but I don't want to go through an entire 3-month process. I just want this behavior to stop and I want an apology from the respondent, right? The accused. So in that kind of situation, they might ask for a mediated conversation with IC members present. So this is called a conciliation. And at the end of it, we will have a settlement agreement where the complainant has put forward these terms, right? It might be a written apology. It might be stopping the behavior. It might also be, for example, moving to a different team, certain things like that, any non-monetary terms. And everybody present has to sign off on the settlement agreement. The case is closed. Let's say that the complainant does not want conciliation, right? Let's say that the respondent is a repeat offender. Or let's say that conciliation fails in that the parties can't agree on the terms, or the respondent says, okay, I will stop the behavior, but then starts retaliating because the complainant has dared to complain. In all these situations, we would go through the full legal inquiry process, and that can take no longer than 3 months or 90 days from the date of the complaint, right? So during that, there will be multiple hearings. So the IC is going to ask you to present your evidences for your side of the story. They're going to ask you to bring in your witnesses, listen to the testimony of all of the witnesses, right? And not to get too technical, but I think, Kirti, as a lawyer, as a non-lawyer, my biggest learning was around, how as an IC, we have to really establish 2 types of answers, right? The first one is questions of fact. So what is it that happened? And this can include everything from CCTV camera footage, right? Things like that. And I think this is something that survivors should know. So it doesn't just have to be the evidences that you can procure, say from phone screenshots or email records, right? It can be so many things like the HR log of the company, which shows when people have signed in and out. So then you can answer the questions of fact, which is what exactly happened, right? And establish that pattern of behavior. And this is something that the witnesses would help as well in establishing. The second thing is questions of law. Is what happened amounting to sexual harassment, right? And once that is answered through the hearings, then the IC goes into a deliberation and they decide whether yes, is what happened constituting sexual harassment? If yes, then proportionally, how can we have some recommendations, right? So this can range from a written apology, maybe a censure by the company formally, all the way to suspension, demotion for 3 years. Maybe they pay a portion of their salary to the complainant for their therapy costs, right, for 6 months. And finally, they may even be asked to leave the company, right? So all of these things are things that would happen if, in terms of the complainant wanting to know, right, what are exactly the timelines you can expect. The whole process, as I said, the legal inquiry usually takes about 3 months or 90 days. After that, the internal committee has 10 days to put together the findings report and the case report, and they should be sharing the findings report with both the complainant and the respondent. Let's say if you want to appeal, and we can go into that in a bit, Kirti, that's something that the complainant can do, right? If you want to appeal the findings and things like that. And then the company leadership has 2 months or 60 days to implement all of the recommendations of the IC. So that's usually how it looks.
Right, that's a very all-encompassing overview, Meghna. And I want to go to something very specific because this is a question that we receive a lot at Sahas. How does a survivor go about documenting their case, and what kind of evidence should they strive to collect before they file a complaint?
I think one thing definitely, right, Kirti. I think one thing is it would help us feel much more prepared if we had evidence. And one thing is, as we know, not every case has evidence. Not every case in many ways generates evidence. And that's something I do want to assure anybody listening of, right? The Posh law is very clear. That's not about the evidence or concrete evidence. You don't even need to have witnesses or onlookers and things like that. You can definitely go ahead and escalate. Because one of the principles enshrined in Posh law, which I feel I take as a motto for my life now in many ways, is impact over intent, right? So what matters is the impact on the person receiving the behavior, not the intent of the person initiating the behavior. So at any point, if you feel there was a remark on your appearance, whether it was flattering or derogatory, right? If you feel that there was an explicit joke, all of that is definitely shaped by your personality, your life experience, your exposure. But the law is very clear. Right? It's about treating people as they wish to be treated, not treating people as you wish to be treated. And therefore, if you feel negatively impacted by anybody's behavior, you always have the right to come forward and escalate it, right? Let's say that outside of these circumstantial evidences, there are some evidences that can be brought in. Then I think what is helpful is screenshots, right, of everything from WhatsApp messages to email exchanges, right? Nowadays, I do see that maybe people have recorders, right? Unfortunately, many times video calls and even audio calls have been misused, right? At odd times of the night, like asking somebody to get on a Zoom call, saying, show me your bedroom, show me what you're wearing. All of these are definitely examples of sexual harassment. So if you're able to have any of those recordings, that would be helpful. Another thing is what we can keep in mind is usually right after the incident, right? We might confide in somebody, or we might react to the person who has enacted that behavior, right? The accused. We might say, hey, I really felt uncomfortable. I not like what you just said to me. Now, this again is a timestamp body of proof in that sense, because that does establish that, yes, on the afternoon of this day, right, I went ahead and said this because of what had happened on the call just a few minutes earlier. Let's say, for example, if I am being sexually harassed, right, and you saw me crying in the bathroom later today, then I can always call in Kirti as a witness, and Kirti can say, yes, I'm not sure what happened. Meghna didn't tell me, but on today's what, the 14th of January. So on the 14th of Jan, 2022, right, around 5:30 p.m., I saw Meghna crying copiously in the bathroom. I have no idea what was wrong, but she seemed really upset. So this again helps us answer the questions of fact, that something had happened on the 14th of Jan, 2022, that really upset me, right? So then you can also become a witness in my case, even though you were not a direct eyewitness to the incident. So all of these are examples of circumstantial behavior, and why they can come into a case like this is because Posh is a civil case, right? So therefore, there's something called balance of probability. It doesn't have to be that, oh, beyond a reasonable doubt, I have to be sure this is what happened. The IC just has to feel that, 51% there is the probability that this behavior has occurred. It has had these ripple effects that we're seeing in the evidences and the witnesses, etc. And therefore, we can establish that sexual harassment has occurred. So that's what I always would encourage, right? If possible, as soon as you feel that some of the trauma reactions are passing, please do feel free to put down whatever you remember, because even though it might feel very clear to you now, many times, such as a trauma response, your brain is trying to protect you, it might go away, right? So for yourself, please make some kind of written record. You can record a voice note, whatever feels right to you. You can take screenshots if you have any recordings. Sometimes on Zoom work calls, if something happens, those are already being recorded. All of these can be used. Anything circumstantial, like people who saw you upset, CCTV camera footage, attendance registers, all of these can also be able to establish who was there and what might have happened. So all of these evidences you can use as well.
Meghna, this is going to make such a big difference to so many people listening in, because it's a very challenging area for a lot of people to grapple with. So truly, thank you for being so empathetic and spelling that out. So let's talk a little bit about the rights of a survivor in the process of seeking redress, Meghna. There's so many gray areas around this. So if you could speak about some of the key rights a survivor has and how they can safeguard that, that would be great.
Yeah, and I think, Kirti, is a great question to ask, because many times on our chatbot, right, on our product PoshPal, this is what people ask. They're like, can I take leave because I'm scared to see this person right after complaining, right? And this is a very valid fear. It is rooted in data, because whether it's walking away from abusive relationships or, reporting perpetrators of workplace violence, this does become the most dangerous period for survivors, right? And that's why I think, as I say, POSH law is a very employee-centric law, right? The first thing it enables the complainant to do is to ask the IC for something called interim relief. Even if you go to the local committee, you can still ask them and they will tell your employer to provide this relief to you, right? So the first one is paid leave during the case. So after the holidays that you are already allocated, right? You're already entitled to, this is on top of that. So if the case goes on for all 90 days, then you will have paid leave for all 90 of those days. So that's something we do encourage complainants to take advantage of, simply because you might feel that, no, it's not going to be a big deal, you know, I can deal with it, things like that. Keep in mind that later, if you change your mind, you can always ask for this, right? So that's one big thing, the paid leave. The second type of interim relief is also asking for a different manager if your complaint is against your manager, right? So this could be anybody supervising you. It doesn't have to be your manager. It could be your PhD supervisor, for example. So if this person is reporting on your professional, you know, performance in any way, then during the case, they're not allowed to do that. So you might have a skip level manager taking over. You might have somebody else, right? But making sure that they are changing the manager is the first thing the internal committee should also take care of. The second thing is, of course, during, you know, a case, it's a very awkward and stressful time for everybody involved. So you can ask for a transfer of yourself or the accused to a different team or a different geography. This again might seem unnecessary in the beginning, but if you change your mind at any time, you can ask for these three types of interim relief. So once again, they're paid leave, different manager, change of manager, and finally changing the team for yourself or for the accused, right? You can always tap into any of these interim reliefs. I think the second thing, and one that a lot of people overlook when it comes to a POSH complaint, is that other people can be a complainant on your behalf, right? So let's say that I have seen an incident of sexual harassment occur with my colleague, and my colleague is now very traumatized, right? Perhaps the 3 to 6 month window is passing. And that is when POSH law recommends that we go ahead and report, right? Within 3 to 6 months from the last incident, when my colleague is not able to do it. Perhaps my colleague asks me to do it for them. Then I can go ahead and do that. As long as I have full knowledge of the incident and I have the written consent of my colleague, I can go ahead and do that. If you look at the POSH law, or even our company policy, right? It states that there's so many different scenarios in which everybody from a National Commission for Women member, my psychologist, my relative can go ahead and become a complainant on my behalf. And that's why I think the law also keeps it very flexible. They are like, for any other reason, right? With your written consent, they can go ahead and become a complainant on your behalf. So that's something I've not seen a lot of complainants take advantage of, but something I would encourage, because unfortunately right now the reporting window is a little limited, as you know, right? So it's 3 months from the last incident, up to 6 months it can be stretched. But unfortunately, if the trauma response is very strong, especially, right? Or sometimes there can even be physical, sort of responses that prevent us from coming forward. Please feel free to give that written consent if you feel comfortable to somebody else so that they can become a complainant on your behalf. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Right, absolutely, Meghna. Thank you for spelling that out. One other gray area, or perhaps a place where most people feel uncomfortable about complaining, is the fear of termination. There's a tendency to assume that should they speak up, they may be dismissed from the workplace, they may be transferred, demoted, or just terminated entirely. Could you speak a little bit to that and what rights a survivor has in that kind of a scenario?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Kirti, right? I think one thing for survivors and everybody watching this to know is that the minute we submit a written complaint, there is a legal obligation on the company to close that case, right? And when I have seen this happen, unfortunately, is when there's been a verbal complaint. Legally speaking, the internal committee also can't start working on that verbal complaint. And there is no record of this verbal complaint anywhere, right? The person might have also gone to the HR, who, as we know, legally is not on the IC. Usually your head of HR is not on the IC, unless it's a very small company, then there are some edge cases, right? So now what has happened is this complaint has gone into the ether as such. It has created a lot of panic and might result in a wrongful termination, right? It might be an accusation of incompetence, but there's no record of such incompetence and things like that. And there's no evidence for it, all of these things. Of course, if any of this has occurred, again, we do recommend, please make sure that, you have all of this evidence, whatever can support your claim, right? It could be your performance appraisals, over the last 3 to 5 years. It could be conversations with your immediate manager and peers, right, who can vouch for you. You can always approach a good labor lawyer, and you can take this up in the labor courts, right? But in terms of how we can prevent something like this from happening is to maybe not make these verbal complaints, not go to the HR. If you know you want to make a complaint of POSH, of sexual harassment and sexual misconduct, you should go to the head of the internal committee. You can find that in your POSH policy again, right? And please do send a written complaint on email so that that record is there. Now, while this complaint is going on, you can't be terminated, right? So if that is what is happening, there's a lot of pressure to terminate you if they're trying to pressure you into accepting a conciliation or mediation. This again is a complainant's choice only, right? The accused cannot ask for it, the internal committee cannot push for it, and definitely the HR cannot pressure somebody saying you have to take conciliation, otherwise we'll make sure that you can't stay on. So all of these things are completely illegal. I would encourage everyone to maintain as many records of these kinds of things as possible. You can also record some of these conversations if possible and take it up in the labor courts with a good labor lawyer. But the minute it's in writing, the company also knows that they have to close the complaint. Otherwise, there will be that record that there is an open case, right? And later their legal liability will definitely increase. So I think these are all things that complainants should keep in mind. But the most important one is always like put it in writing for yourself. And then when you want to complain, please do put it in writing for the official authorities.
Got it. Got it. Thank you for that, Meghna. So what is the nature of the decision of the ICC? Is it binding, and what does the appeal process against that decision look like?
Yeah. So as you know, Kirti, the internal committee, right, is vested with the powers of a civil court. So that means unlike a criminal court, they cannot pass judgments, but they can give recommendations, right? So once again, the internal committee will go ahead and answer the questions of fact, find out what happened, right? And then they will think about, is what happened constituting sexual harassment, and think about what kind of recommendations they can give that's proportional to. Now, as you know, the law mentions, they will pass this on, they'll pass on this case report to the company leadership. Company leadership has 60 days or 2 months to implement all these recommendations. So what I do want to clarify is that this is not a cherry picking sort of process, right? It's not that the leadership can pick and choose that the recommendations we agree with are these 3. And these last 2 we think are too harsh or not relevant and we will not implement them. That's not how it works. If there are 5, they have to implement all 5, right? They might take the whole 2 months. They might take 60 days to implement it, but legally they're bound to implement all of this. Now, let's say that, after the 90 days, now there's been a findings report, right? The IC has said, okay, there were 5 allegations, 3 were proved, 1 was not proved, right? And for 1, we didn't have sufficient evidence, so again, not proved, something like that. Now, what the complainant can do in that situation is they can see if they agree with the findings, right? If they feel that they do not agree for whatever reason, if they feel like they want to add some additional evidence, for example, any example of retaliation, right? And subtle harassment. Sometimes this harassment might not be coming directly from the accused. It might be coming from other people, right? So for example, I have complained against X. X is not speaking to me because during the case, usually you have to keep things confidential. You have to stay away from each other. But X might now be exerting their influence to make sure that, my expense reimbursement claims are being rejected by other people, right? Perhaps nobody else is speaking to me during lunch or anything like that, because it's become very clear that confidentiality has not actually been followed. So all of this becomes additional information that I can take into the appeals process. So most companies, they must have this in the policy as well. They will have an internal sort of appellate authority almost, right? So this would be a person, an authority to whom I can take my appeal. I can give this additional evidence as well. Or perhaps I can point out how the legal process was not followed. Many times what happens is, both parties have to know what is the story that the other party is saying, because lawyers are not allowed here, right? I have to give my own sort of defense. I have to know exactly what are the evidences the other party is giving, as well as what the witnesses are saying. Now, if these pieces of information are not shared with both parties, this means that the internal committee has not followed the legal process, right? So this can also be grounds for an appeal. Apart from additional evidence, if I know the legal process has not been followed, then I can go to the internal authority and present evidences of the legal process not being followed. And then they will accordingly, take action. So this is the appeals process. I will put this caveat that not all companies that have an IC, right, might have appointed an internal appeals authority, but that still should not stop complainants and survivors from seeking that, right? I think that is definitely a legal right. So if there is like a findings report that you want to appeal, and you know that there has been breach of legal process, or you know that, there's a lot of additional evidence that you want to submit, you can definitely go ahead and make sure you reach out to your internal committee and ask for that appeals authority that you can go to.
Thank you for that nugget of information, Meghna. I think it's one of the most neglected to mention areas in the context of POSH redress in the workplace. So sometimes survivors may want to approach both the ICC and a court of law at the same time. One, is that technically possible under the law? And two, is it adversary? Is it advisable? Sorry. Yeah.
Yes. I think one thing is the reason that internal committees, right? The reason that there was a push towards civil bodies being vested with these powers of the civil court is because our judicial system is frankly overloaded, right? And the previous adversarial system, it was found did not work for all kinds of cases. Many times when we think of sexual harassment, any kind of misconduct at the workplace, really, it has much softer aspects. There's always a people aspect, there's a cultural aspect, right? There's sensitivity aspect. So what they felt is that these kind of, in-house courts would be best suited to fast track these cases and also know enough about the context to give contextually relevant judgments, right? So that's one thing to keep in mind, that if you have a functional internal committee, you feel confident that they might be able to do the legal process well and they're willing to extend support, I would always encourage to go there, right? There's also, let's say, many people might choose to take it to a criminal court of the land. That is also something that is possible. And like I mentioned, there's always the police FIR route as well, which can be happening simultaneously. I think it would not be possible legally, Kirti, you can also tell me, right, to have a POSH case going on with your internal committee, which is a civil case, and also approach a civil court of the land, right? I think that might be, and generally also, unfortunately, I have seen, unless there is physical evidence of assault, if a survivor chooses to go both with the POSH case as well as the police FIR, right? And later, let's say there is an appeals, perhaps the appeal goes to the courts of the land, it's seen as quite adversarial, right? Like, why was this complainant doing a POSH case and they were doing a police FIR case? So you can also tell me if, I know legally all these routes exist, but as you know, the way it is seen might be different.
You're absolutely right about that, Meghna, because it's, going back to a statement you said that you also live by, the impact over the intent. I think the intent of the lawmaker has not yet translated into the impact they probably wanted to see happen. Because you're right, like the litigious nature of a complainant is called into question, and they're often raked over the coals for having taken up two procedures, possibly holding up judicial time, as it were.
Right.
But Meghna, this has been so enlightening and so helpful. I'm sure folks who have reached out to us earlier, who may reach out with questions like this, would have already had so many of their doubts cleared. But before I let you go, Meghna, I would love for you to share with us how anyone who's watching this and listening to this can get in touch with Trustin, and perhaps reach out to you to work with Trustin to keep their workplaces safe and healthy.
Yeah, thank you, Kirti, for that. So for all who are listening, and if you're interested, Kirti and I also collaborated on TrustBot. I think we haven't really done much of the marketing yet, but it's been slowly and steadily growing, right? So what TrustBot has is a series of POSH resources to really help anybody facing workplace misconduct, like, how to contact your nearest local committee. What are your interim reliefs? Because right now it might be clear, but while going through the process, we might lose track of some of this information. Unfortunately, the invisible pandemic of domestic violence has also continued, and as work from home has become more and more the norm, right? I think we're seeing that there is a spike in domestic violence. So TrustBot also has those resources for safety at home, right? And I think if you'd like to access TrustBot, you can always come on the Trustin website. So it's at trustin.co.in. You can sign up for a demo of our case management system. You can ask for a conversation with me so we can talk about if you want to do sensitization, you want to set up your policy, you want to train your internal committee, or you also want us to empanel as your external member, we can do all of those things. And yes, if as an individual, you want to access these support resources and share it with other individuals who need them, then please do come on that website and look at TrustBot, right? You can just talk to TrustBot on WhatsApp, and basically that support will always be a finger's click away. So yeah, these are things that we can do.
Thank you so much, Meghna. It's always a delight to work with you, to talk with you, and to listen and learn from you. More power to you and to Trustin, and I truly hope you grow from strength to strength.
Thank you so much, Kirti. Take care.
Thank you.